Hi, and welcome to another edition of Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. I'm Stephen Downs, and I'll be talking to you today about the subject of values. Now, I'm just going to input the video link into the presentation forum here so that people can follow along. If you're following along, you may have just received the newsletter. You'll be surprised to find this presentation in progress. Yes, we did another one at noon today. We did one on ethical issues in ethical codes. And in that presentation, we looked at things like the issues being addressed by codes of conduct in the sense of addressing the purpose of the code, the reason why the code exists as a code, properly so called. In this presentation, we're going to have a bit of a different focus. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at the values and the principles that can be found in the codes. These are the things that underlie the codes themselves. If we say that the code is structured a certain way, or the things that are explicitly described as good or desirable by the code. When people say that there's a universal or a general agreement on values, it's usually with respect to some subset of the values that are listed here in this presentation. Now, some researchers have mapped these values to the ethical principles in question, for example, Feld and others. And in fact, I reference that report in today's Ethics, Analytics, and Duty of Care newsletter. For those of you searching through the archives, that would be the newsletter of November the 4th, 2021. And that's definitely a report worth having a look at because it does draw this map from individual codes to individual values. Now, that report says that there's a consensus with respect to these values, although I think that if we look at these in more detail, we find that there isn't such a consensus, and we'll look at some of that detail in this discussion of values in this presentation. I'm not going to draw those lines here. I'm also not going to limit ourselves to the list of values in the Feld report. We'll find that there are actually more values to consider than just the values that they look at. So that's overall the structure. Now, remember from previously that ethical codes are divided by values, which are the general moral principles, or, well, I don't want to say principles, we use that for another word. General moral values, general desired things, desiderata, general things that are desired, such as honesty or trustworthiness. This is as opposed to principles, which are the ethical conditions or the ethical behaviors that we would expect. So, to follow Cooper here, an ethical principle is a statement concerning the conduct or state of being that is required for the fulfillment of a value. It explicitly links a value with a general mode of action. Now, if that sounds a little convoluted, I agree. But, the best example or the best way of understanding values is to look at the examples of the values that are considered as important in the ethical codes that we've been studying. So, as with previous videos, I'm going to go through the list of them. I try to develop a bit of a theme as we go through this list, but it's a bit choppy, and you can probably take this video and break it down into the individual parts, one little bit of video for each value. All right, so let's look at the first, pursuit of knowledge. And pursuit of knowledge has two aspects to it. One aspect is original research, that is to say, pursuit of knowledge by society as a whole. And the second aspect of it is pursuit of knowledge as learning or studying a discipline. That's to be thought of as pursuit of knowledge as experienced by, say, a student or even a lifelong learner. So a number of these codes of ethics talk about the pursuit of knowledge as a value to be pursued. We have the Simon Fraser University Code of Ethics, admittedly from 30 years ago, saying the first responsibility of university teachers is the pursuit and dissemination of knowledge and understanding through teaching and research. But they're not alone. The National Education Association, back in 1975, the supreme importance of the pursuit of truth, devotion to excellence, and the nurture of democratic principles. We'll talk about democratic principles later on. But the idea here, and the Sigma Delta Chi's new code of ethics asserts that the primary function of journalism is to inform the public and serve the truth. So pursuit of knowledge isn't limited to academic domains. Whether it's the first responsibility or the sole responsibility is certainly something that could be questioned. I would certainly worry if that a university professor said, my sole value is the pursuit of knowledge. We can get into trouble that way if that is our only source of value. Nonetheless, it's certainly one that has been raised as important by numerous codes of ethics. The next one, autonomy and individual value. Now, this is something that can actually be represented in different ways, and I've put up 3 ways here in this slide. One way is believing in the idea of the worth and dignity of each human being. And this is the Kantian principle of treating people as ends and not means. That is to say, people are not to be used for some other purpose other than serving to their, helping them to their own, benefit. Searching for a word there, not quite finding it. Helping them pursue their own ends, I suppose. It's also worth noting Peter Singer would extend this to the worth and dignity of animals and even the environment. These things have value in and of themselves. So that's one way of looking at autonomy and individual value as a value. Another way of looking at it is thinking of autonomy as something a bit different, embracing the idea of informed consent. Now, we're going to look at consent a little bit later on as a value in and of itself, but it certainly ties into the idea of individual value and humans as ends, not means. There's a relationship here, the idea that a person has to agree that something is of value before it becomes of value. Or there's even a third way of looking at these, basically combining the first two things. It's a two-parter. First, the idea that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. And indeed, arguably, and it has been argued, you can't even conceive of the concept of ethics as a discipline unless people are autonomous agents. There's the principle ought implies can. Somebody ought to do something only if they can do something. And the fact of something being right as opposed to wrong happens only if you had the choice to do one thing or the other. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is the idea that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So individual value isn't completely taken up in the principle of autonomy. Autonomy is separate from that because there are going to be people who aren't able to care for themselves, aren't able to make informed decisions, and yet still have value on this theory and therefore are entitled to protection. So we lump autonomy and individual value here together as a single value and encompass a number of different ideas with that. Tom Beauchamp's and James Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics, we'll refer to that again a bit further, contains an extended discussion of the idea of autonomy embracing the idea of informed consent. And this is going to have a number of conditions, including the disclosure of information, the respect for decision making, and the provision of advice when required. Similarly, the Belmont report, which begins by identifying respect for persons, is also going to say that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. So when we look at the principle of consent, this principle itself, without reference to the principle of autonomy, is often also considered as a fundamental value in many ethical codes. The type of consent, there are various ways of thinking of consent. The type of consent defined by the Nuremberg Code requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision, and I'm quoting here, by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. So that's a fairly complex set of conditions. They're commonly expressed using the acronym FRIES. So the idea that consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, which I think goes beyond the Nuremberg definition, and specific. It's not a blanket consent, but specific to that particular act or that particular collection of data. Now, it's interesting the way consent is applied in today's society, and as I remark on the slide here, the Nuremberg Code, on the one hand, and marketing research, on the other hand, may stand at opposite poles of an ethical question. Marketing research, indeed, involves ideas of consent for follow-on uses of data, consent for non-research uses of data, for example, consent to have your data collected and then used to market to you. And that may be something that a person doesn't know that they're consenting to. But, as I say here, they are reflective of a society that, as a whole, holds consent as sacrosanct on the one hand and makes legal end-user licensing agreements on the other hand. Now, of course, these licensing agreements are famously vague, obscure, long, hidden, in favor of the company or data collector, and almost never, ever read. Another fundamental principle or value that is found in many ethical codes is the principle of integrity. I shouldn't call these principles, I should call these values because of the way we divided it up, but I'm so used to talking in the language of principles, a value being a principle of such and such, and so I'll probably keep speaking that way, but we need to keep separate, again, the idea of values as the things that people aim for, principles as the actual instantiation of a value. Nonetheless, Different ethical codes stress different aspects of integrity. For example, one code, the EUI, stresses honesty, trust, fairness, and respect. Okay. Another one speaks of integrity as consisting of accuracy, honesty, objectivity, openness, disclosure, and avoidance of conflict of interest. It's interesting here, and we see this elsewhere, where one value is made up of a set of other values. And if you go back and you look at these other values, they're made up of a set of values that may include this value. So it can get pretty circular if we're looking at the broad swath of values in ethical principles. Another definition from Guyana talks of integrity as including the honest representation of one's own credentials, fulfillment of contracts, and accountability for expenses. And that was unique. Very few discussions of very few ethical code discussions actually discuss things like fulfillment of contracts and accountability for expenses and the ordinary sorts of business integrity principles we would expect. In general, though, and this is a image that I found in Quora, we could say in something like integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fast, fun, or easy, and choosing to practice our values rather than simply professing them. Now, given that integrity is one of these values, it's kind of like saying integrity is choosing to practice integrity, which isn't especially useful. Another value frequently discussed in ethical principles is confidentiality. This is often presented as a virtue in and of itself, or as we've seen, sometimes also considered constitutive of another value, for example, of integrity. Confidentiality is often expressed in terms of privacy, sometimes in terms of trust, and is often considered a core principle for data and information services and codes regulating those. We'll also find confidentiality coming up a lot in business ethics, as well as medical ethics and legal ethics, where there is, of course, what we refer to as the privileged client relationship with the doctor or with the lawyer. It's interesting that confidentiality is a value, and later on we will be talking about openness as a value, and there is this division between the two. I don't want to say contradiction, that's not necessarily the case, but there's certainly a tension between the two. It should be noted that exceptions of confidentiality may be allowed, and some codes of ethics specifically express this. For example, the British Columbia Teachers Federation Code explicitly says it won't be considered a breach of the Code of Ethics to follow legal requirements, for example, for reporting child protection issues. Similarly, in medical informatics, there might be a legal need to release medical information in order to protect the equal and competing rights of others. Another principle, and one that's core to this course, at least in the discussion of it, is care. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about care. In fact, I have a whole module devoted to it later on in the course. But it does show up in a number of these codes of ethics as a core value, and so it's relevant to include it here. How care is depicted varies from code to code. For example, in the OCT, care is depicted as compassion, acceptance, interest, and insight for developing students' potential. Similarly, another teacher code, treating all children with love and affection, irrespective of their school performance and achievement level. Now, I mention these two specifically because we see nothing resembling that in codes of ethics discussing data management or artificial intelligence or the more technical disciplines. There's another interpretation of care, which is a more legalist interpretation and is specifically headed duty of care. So, for example, that researchers must prioritize data subject privacy over business objectives. Now, this again is one of these things where there's going to be a balancing between the two because data subject privacy, as we've seen previously, is not going to be a completely binding value. There may be exceptions in privacy and confidentiality, for example, legal purposes. Now, it may be a business objective to follow the law, so there is a case in which a business objective can result in a violation of privacy, even if, in fact, we are prioritizing data subject privacy above business objectives. I know that sounds like we're tangling ourselves up in knots, but that's really what happens when we try to work these things out sometimes. Another value is competence and authority, and this is raised in a variety of different codes, especially in financial codes, engineering, psychology, etc. There's the expectation that professionals perform in a competent manner. That's a value in and of itself. There's also the requirement that they remain within their domain of competence. So it's a violation of a code of ethics, for example, for a psychologist to use their credentials to make pronouncements on physics, or vice versa. And then third, in many codes, there's an obligation on the part of professionals to ensure that unqualified people do not practice the profession. Now, of course, what constitutes unqualified people is defined typically by the association or body of practice itself. So doctors define for themselves what counts as a qualified and what counts as an unqualified doctor, and then they make it a value to make sure that unqualified doctors don't practice medicine, which seems a bit self-serving, but we can see the reasoning for it. And that is the expectation that somebody who calls themselves a doctor will actually be a doctor and be competent in that manner. Sometimes what actually counts as competence is spelled out in the code. For example, some data research codes of ethics talk explicitly about the use of robust data models, and they also say things like the analysis of data and data collections should be sound and free from bias. The Royal Society Data Ethics Governance Report is one such organization, and so are provisions in the Open University Code of Ethics. Next, value and benefit. These are principles that often come from the business world and have a specific meaning in the business world. And I've tried to depict that by using the diagram below from Gartner. And see if I can't make that a little bigger so you have a better view of it here. So on the one hand, we have value, and on the other hand, we have benefits. Value comes from the outside in. Something has value if It's addressing challenges, addressing pain points, responding to the cost of doing nothing, as experienced by people who are not you. In other words, as experienced by your customers or your clients or perhaps society as a whole. Benefits, on the other hand, are more personal. Something is a benefit to you. So a solution, a feature to you. So a solution, a feature, a key improvement, a benefit. That's something that you bring to the table. And the combination of benefits and values create what Gartner says here is your unique value. Now, when you listen to me talk about educational technology, I'll rarely talk about value, but I'll fairly frequently talk about benefit. And I won't talk about value so much because I'm concerned about the idea of value being something defined in monetary terms, value being something that speaks toward the commodification of whatever practice, service, or product we're discussing, as opposed to benefit, which I do discuss quite a bit because the benefit essentially constitutes the reason why a person would want to use a specific tool, application, practice, or whatever. So, representing that, if you will, as a personal sense of ethics, I think that working toward benefits is a value. Working toward value, that is to say monetization, is not so much a value. It's hard to keep these terms straight because a lot of these terms have multiple meanings depending on the context in which they're used. Anyhow, all of that said, previously we talked in the previous presentation about the good that can be done. And that's something that is aspirational, something that we're trying to achieve. And that's the reason for these ethical codes. Here, we're looking at the same principle, but as a limit, as something that defines the scope of what we're doing. And in that sense, we see it a lot across these ethical codes. For example, in Kennedy, obligation to distinguish between remedies that represent the careful consensus of highly trained experts and snake oil. Or on the other hand, Drew, show clear user need and public benefit. Lamar principles state shared broadly to the benefit of all humanity. The Barcelona Principles on Data Collection specify purposes of data gathering in advance. So you see how all of these are in one way or another trying to reach for and find this value or this benefit in the research work or in the product development work that is being accomplished by the analytics or the AI in question, and indeed, to bring it back to teaching and learning, by the educational intervention, technology, or practice in question. And I think that's a fair point. I think that with respect to educational technology especially, it should do some good. It should actually show a clear user need and public benefit and should be distinguished from snake oil. So I think you can see how this principle becomes a core principle, a core value in ethical codes of practice. Moving on, non-maleficence. In other words, don't be evil. Now, this is a principle that originates in the Hippocratic Oath. and the Hippocratic Oath expressed in Latin, primum non nocere, first do no harm. It turns out that this is not a good principle for medical practitioners because there are many cases in which they have to do harm in order to do something that is a greater good. For example, in the obvious cases, surgery, you're going to actually take a knife and cut a person open. That is harm. There's no denying that. It takes harm. It causes harm, and it takes weeks, maybe months to recover from that, and is of risk of being fatal. But we have operations because we know that if you cut someone open and do stuff, you can save them from much more serious consequences. So the idea transforms to a principle of non-maleficence, that is to say, don't cause harm deliberately. Harm may be unavoidable, but don't create avoidable harm. Or as Beauchamp and Childress say, avoiding anything which is unnecessarily or unjustifiably harmful. Now, what counts here as harm is subject for discussion. I'll raise a couple of issues right off the bat. First, the consideration of what counts as harm has to include what the subject considers to be harm. It doesn't work if you say to somebody, I'm not harming you at all, if they're screaming and shrieking in terror. Obviously, there's a difference of perception happening here, and what counts as harm has to include that other perception. Also, harm doesn't have to be physical harm, and this is something I've mentioned before. Non-maleficence in research and data science could be, for example, being, as Drew says, minimally intrusive. So you don't ask for any more information than you need for this particular purpose, for the specific thing that you're doing. So the non-maleficence doctrine includes a range of things. It includes not only the nature and priority of patient care, but it includes respect for law, respecting the patient's rights, inspecting confidences and privacy, refraining from, as Riddick says, crimes against humanity. It includes minimizing negative consequences of computing, including threats to health, safety, personal security, and privacy. Also including destruction or disclosure of information, unjustified damage to property, reputation, and the environment. That latter comes from the Association for Computing Machinery. So harm can be very broadly construed. What counts as harm may depend on your point of view. And the core here, though, is even though harm may sometimes be caused, the idea is that you don't cause harm unless you need to for some greater good, however that is defined. Now, the twin, if you will, of non-maleficence is beneficence. And this is more than just non-maleficence, right? Do no evil is not the same as do good. And beneficence means something like do good. And it's distinct from simply value and benefit as well. Aldcroft talks about it as the principle of acting with the best interest of the other in mind. Beauchamp and Childress, again, say that the demonstration of beneficence is shown not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also by making efforts to secure their well-being. There are these beneficence and non-maleficence join autonomy and justice, which we'll look at as the four core principles of bioethics identified by these two authors. Now, we're looking at many more values than these, but it's worth considering that these four are considered the core for that particular discipline. Would this apply as well in learning analytics or the application of artificial intelligence to learning? It's not clear that it would. Again, we don't have the pursuit of knowledge anywhere in this, for example, and there may be other values that are applicable in this discipline that are not, at least according to these two authors, applicable specifically in bioethics. Finally, as well, the question of the good arises when we ask who's good. Should the common good be included in a principle of beneficence? Should we, for example, say that artificial intelligence should promote social justice, or should it merely be developed consistently with the principles of social justice? Or is it sufficient that they provide individual and personal good without regard to the wider objectives? Is it an ethical principle that you should promote social justice? Or is it an ethical principle that you should just simply act consistently with the principles of social justice? Is everybody required to address that issue? Or is it okay if we just simply don't cause more violations of that principle? I think these are good questions, and it's not clear to me that they're answered even with the existing text of many of these principles. Respect is another principle that you see this a lot in academic ethics and professional ethics. Different ways of describing respect, but you see different phrasing. I've got a number of them here. Acting towards students with respect and dignity, for example. Treasury Board Secretariat talks about respect for people. Folan, talking about professional ethics, talks about mutual respect. Respect can include the composite culture of India, or in my case, the composite culture of Canada. So it could include cultural respect, and it could include other kinds of collective respect, respect for religious traditions perhaps, respect for language rights, so on. There's the idea of the respect for the rights and dignity of learners, and that brings us back to the idea of the value of a human, and treating them as ends and not means, or in AI for All, promoting human dignity and flourishing as a type of respect. Related to this in several ways is the value of democracy, or I may say the principle of democracy, using again the word principle in multiple senses here. There are different ways that democracy can be expressed in an ethical code. One, and we see this especially in political ethics or public service ethics, which may include college and university ethics, depending on where you live, where democracy means respect for the idea of rule by the people and respect for the results of democratic choice. That is to say, especially if you're in the public service, respecting that people have chosen one government rather than another, and that if you're in the public service, you are working for that one government rather than the other. Or Respect may mean, in this case, respect for democratic values such as justice or non-discrimination. So, it's interesting to note that democracy is identified as both an input and an output of ethical codes. It's an input in the sense that the ethical codes are the result of a democratic process, and it's an output in the sense that the democratic process is a value expressed by the ethical code. So, a nice tight little circle there. Related to democracy is the principle of justice. And in earlier formulations of this, I had justice and fairness lumped together. I might still do that. But ever since John Rawls' theory, which is now about 50 years old, ever since his book, A Theory of Justice, came out, the concepts of justice and fairness have been linked in popular discourse. That is to say, the principle attributed to him essentially is justice as fairness. Now, for Rawls, these aren't the core principles in and of themselves. In his book, he describes a mechanism whereby people draft a sort of social contract. They're grouped together in what might be called an original position with a cloak of blindness, in the sense they're negotiating what society will look like. So there's the contract aspect, but they don't know who they will be in that forthcoming society. They don't know whether they will be rich or poor, black or white, hardware clerks or bankers. All of this is unknown to them. And according to Rawls, when people are put into that situation, the kind of justice that they will negotiate among themselves is something like justice as fairness. Now, it's arguable, and people have argued with respect to Rawls, that what he's doing is saying, what he's doing is representing the sort of idea of justice that already exists in his own community, in his own environment. And that, in other words, the original position is just a long, involved process of rationalization of a theory that he already holds. And it's really hard to deal with hypotheticals like this original position. Just as for thought experiments in general, we can say, well, yeah, people would reach that sort of agreement. But we might also say, well, no, they wouldn't. And then it becomes hard to know what sort of evidence that you would bring to support one side or another. There are different accounts of justice as well. Justice is sometimes thought of as natural justice. And you see this a lot in rights-based codes of ethics, where we think of natural and universal human rights. It is universally affirmed that the rights of all people include, etc., etc. So something might be a right simply by virtue of the nature of their existence. And if you go back even to, say, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when he describes his social contract, he goes back to the idea of a state of nature and what life was like in the state of nature. And then he says, the trappings of civilization gradually erode the rights that we had in the state of nature. As he says famously, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Another way of talking about justice is as an endorsement of diversity and prohibition of discrimination. And this is an appeal to a sense of equity or a sense of equality, depending on the circumstances that you're talking about. It goes back to the principle of Solon in ancient Greece, coming up with the code of law, the idea being that the same law applies to everyone. And so when you see people today talk about one law applying to one person, a different law applying to a different person, they're appealing to this sense of justice and saying that it's unjust for one person to benefit from the law and another person to be penalized from it. Finally, it should be noted that the concept of justice doesn't need to apply simply in the present tense. Justice can be expanded to include redress for current or past wrongs or to prevent future wrongs. And a good example of that in Canada is the Truth and Reconciliation process, wherein Canada as a nation recognizes that injustices have taken place against Indigenous people in the past, and that the full expression of justice would include redress for those wrongs sometime in the present or the future. Now, with respect to the principle of justice as fairness, this is sort of almost going from the frying pan into the fire, because it's not clear that there is a single universal account of fairness. Here, I've put up. It's not really it's sort of like a model or a framework for talking about fairness, and talking about fairness specifically in the context of analytics and AI. So the major elements of analytics and AI that we have here, the training data, which is the data that we use in order to create our model in the first place, that is to say, the network of connections in our artificial intelligence agent. Then there's the source data. That's what we're feeding that model right now in order to get some sort of prediction or outcome. For example, a risk assessment or a prediction that somebody will fail their class. And then the algorithm itself, which is how we define that the rules that govern the model. So in a neural network, for example, how we describe what the individual entities of the network are, what kind of connections they'll have, how we measure these connections, the strength of these connections, or the activation states of the individual neurons, the topography of the network, maybe the number of iterations, or the types of iterations, or the way we vary conditions for the iterations. All of this describes the algorithm. Now, fairness comes into play for all of these things. In the training data, for example, we ask, are there unjust biases? Which is interesting the way this is phrased, right? Because it suggests, maybe not inaccurately, that there can be just biases. So we ask, what kind of biases in the training data are fair, and what kinds of biases are unfair? What historical reference points are fair or unfair? Similarly, with the source data, the data that we're applying our model to right now, we can ask, is it fair to apply this model in this circumstances? What degree of accuracy of outcome is going to be fair in the current case? How right does it have to be? The algorithm, understanding what counts as fair when you're talking about, say, an activation function is a hard question. Is one kind of activation function fair and the other unfair? It almost seems like a category error to ask that question. Nonetheless, when we look at code generally, we can go back to the principle of Lawrence Lessig: code is law. The law can be unfair, therefore the code that produces the law can be unfair. But tracking that relationship is difficult. We ask, what are the appropriate rules or policies to apply fairness in the algorithm? And indeed, even what are the ethical norms for a fair or unfair algorithm? And then the outcome, we ask things like, is the outcome biased? Is the outcome fair? Is it effective? All of these are different considerations. Now, I haven't even talked about the concept of fairness in more general terms. I've kept the discussion here fairly specific to the four major elements of machine learning or analytics. But we can broaden our discussion of fairness and ask what is fair just on a general basis. Fairness might include rights, it might include non-discrimination, it might include redress, it might reference some other core value or principle, for example, autonomy or the inherent value of a person. Some of these might not necessarily be consistent principles. Fairness might be being open, or fairness might be being confidential. Without a discussion of fairness or a common understanding of fairness, you can't then turn around and say, well, there is consensus on the idea that fairness is a fundamental ethical principle. This all ties in with the concept of accountability and explicability. These are not the same, although it makes sense to put them together. Accountability is something that we're reasonably familiar with in the sense of holding someone or something responsible or held to answer for the outcome of something. Explicability, which one of my colleagues said isn't even a word, I think it's becoming a word though, is more like being able to explain or give an account of the process or the reasoning that produced the outcome that it did. The idea here is that, as the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario says, restrictions should be subject to independent scrutiny, and the state must remain transparent and accountable for its use of intrusive powers through subsequent, timely, and independent scrutiny of their use. Now, by intrusive, we might be talking here about any application of analytics or AI. We don't need to think of intrusive narrowly, and indeed it makes sense to think of intrusive as broadly as is necessary for these circumstances. So we have different ways in which these principles come up. In the case of academic and medical research, accountability typically is defined with reference to being answerable to, there's a train, hi train, being answerable to or responsible to a research ethics board. And that is the case in our organization, and I sit on one of those boards. In other disciplines, there might be a range of additional processes to describe accountability and explicability, including, for example, predictability, auditing, and review. That's kind of like saying if you have two accountants with the same set of data, you should produce the same accounting spreadsheets. It shouldn't be different. It's interesting because that actually carries over into replicability in scientific experimentation, and the idea that if you describe a new scientific principle, then the experiments that support that principle ought to be replicable. That is to say, that you can explain them well enough that somebody else who is not you can conduct the same experiment and reach the same result. And that is a value underlying many of these ethical codes. Floridi says explicability understood as incorporating both intelligibility and accountability, where we should be able to obtain a factual, direct, and clear explanation of the decision-making process. So there's this sense here in not just, in principle, you can account for it and explain it, but in practice, it has to be such that other people can understand. And then finally, and this is particularly relevant with respect to analytics and artificial intelligence, there needs to be meaningful human control. That is to say, if there is not a human at the end accountable, then the principle of accountability hasn't been applied. The value of accountability has not been respected. That's a lot, and I think that goes well beyond the principles of ethics and bioethics. Now, related to accountability is openness, and openness is something that we could spend an entire course talking about. Many of the codes of ethics, and especially those dedicated to research, express openness as a core value, though often with conditions. Now, there are different ways of depicting openness. Openness can be thought of almost in a legal context, as in the case of Richard Stallman's Four Freedoms. Now, I know Stallman would not say that this amounts to openness, but a lot of people would. So the Four Freedoms are the right to read, to reuse, to modify, and share software. Now, I personally asked Stallman whether this applies to, say, documentation and content, and his response to me was, no, this applies only to software. These principles weren't designed for other things. And so, but they have been applied, for example, by David Wiley to things like content, and we could certainly talk about them applying to data, to algorithms, and to AI models. Another way of thinking of openness is the FAIR principles, as expressed by the FAIR Coalition, particularly with respect to data. These principles are findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. We can also think, and this is the way I've thought about it over the years, of openness understood as open access. And so this is taking the concept and looking at it from a different perspective. Openness can be seen as a value from the point of view of one who has the object or the data or the code, and the Four Freedoms basically describe this, right? So the resource is open in terms of what you can do with it. But openness can also be talked about in terms of, or from the perspective of people who do not yet have access to the resource. And that's the principle I think of it as. I think of openness as saying that people who do not have access to a thing should be easily able to have access to that thing. And then there's this kind of middle sense of openness where the sorts of things that count as access or what you can do are described in more detail. Reading, reusing, interoperating, finding, discovering, etc. And I think that a broad definition of openness needs to include all of these. In education, of course, openness not only refers to openness in terms of access to resources, but also in terms of open educational practices. And I wanted to put this diagram at the bottom here where we look at openness as one of the big 5 personality traits, and we'll come back to that, in the sense of openness to new ideas or cognitive exploration. And there's 2 aspects to openness here. Openness itself, just being open to new ideas, and then openness from the perspective of intellect. And if you bring in being open to ideas and apply intellect to it, we get things like innovation and imagination. Now, that diagram also might just be fantasy. It does seem very neat to describe such a messy process, but it does raise for me, I think, another aspect of these underlying values that we're talking about in codes of ethics. So far, all of these values really are described in terms of either as of processes or outcomes, and they're almost mechanistic in nature, or even legalistic in nature. But there's a whole school of thought that looks at personality traits. Now, here I'm not talking about learning styles necessarily, but I'm talking about ethics being described as an aspect of character rather than what you do or what results. And we'll see more about that in the next module. But for now, we can look at openness, as mentioned, from the perspective of one of these big 5 personality traits. The 5 altogether are extroversion, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, and neuroticism. Now, what counts as a virtue here, or what counts as a value, isn't obvious. Take extroversion, for example. Is it a virtue to be outgoing and energetic? It often is represented as a value, as an ethical value. It's good to be outgoing and energetic. I'm someone who's solitary and reserved, and I know you wouldn't know that from this video, but I'm all by myself in a room. That's why this is working so well for me. Agreeableness. Again, the check mark goes for friendly and compassionate. And the X mark goes for critical and rational. Well, I'm pretty critical and rational, but I think of that as a good thing. I think that it is an ethical value to be critical and rational, because I go back to that provision about snake oil. The friendly, compassionate person might also be the sort of person who is very tolerant of snake oil, or very tolerant of lack of quality. The cracks rather than digging into them. By contrast, openness to experience is very much something that does describe me, I would say. Is that a value? I think it is. But caution and consistency are also represented as values. So again, and caution and consistency, well, we just talked about replicability of process as a virtue, as a value. Similarly, now it might apply here. Conscientiousness, efficient and organized, is typically represented as a virtue. Now, that doesn't show up in any of these ethical principles. None of the principles says, a professional is efficient and organized, although that's kind of implied by the principle of competence, as opposed to extravagant and careless, which are represented as, maybe not values, but extravagant can sometimes also be described as generous. Someone who's careless might also be described as a free spirit. So again, it depends on your perspective here whether this is a value or not a value. Finally, the badly named trait neuroticism draws the distinction between sensitivity and resilience. We see resilience represented all over the place, especially in educational literature, as a value. Now again, resilience rarely shows up in any of these ethical principles, but I'd be willing to say that if it were put to the drafters of these documents, whether resilience or confidence, or shall we say trust, are values that should be represented, a lot of them might have said, yeah, we never thought of that. Certainly being sensitive or being nervous are not represented as values. Nonetheless, being sensitive and being nervous are very often traits associated with creativity and artistic endeavors. I would actually put myself more in the sensitive, nervous category than in the resilient, confident category. Again, this video maybe belies that, but nonetheless, after I do this video, I'm going to spend some time thinking about whether I really did the right thing, was it a good video, etc. And that's a good thing. It's, I don't want to just confidently go forth and proclaim that my ideas are all true without being sensitive or nervous about the fact that maybe they're not true, and being accountable for that, and willing to explain my reasoning, how I came to the decisions that I did, and so on. So there are different ways of talking about value, and even our representation of the concept of value in the context of ethical codes takes this concept and kind of shrinks it, so that we're not talking about people anymore. We're talking about processes and outcomes. And these processes and outcomes may or may not be ethical. These values that describe these processes and outcomes may or may not be ethical. Arguably, they probably are. But it's a very narrow sense of ethical. And again, it's a very mechanistic and technical sense of ethical. And it's something that, rubs people the wrong way. And maybe that's a bad way of expressing it. It's something that doesn't feel right to people, at least to me. The idea of a code of ethics as being definitive of ethics doesn't quite capture it. So, perhaps that's why this last value is so often seen as necessary. This last value, and again, it shows up in many ethical codes, of common cause or solidarity. So, some codes explicitly endorse an advocacy role for professionals to promote the values that are stated in the code. So promote fairness, promote justice, promote competence, etc. And they also express advocacy for people to come together to identify the values, knowledge, and skills that are distinctive to the profession. So, in other words, the code of ethics declare that one of the value of the code of ethics is the coming together to form a common code of ethics, which again might be seen as a little bit self-serving, or it might be seen as a little bit circular. And I think it's interesting that ethics, as considered by these codes of ethics, is almost by definition something that people need to hold in common, and so much so that they're the sorts of things that need to be marketed, promoted, or advocated by members of the profession. And I think that when we look at codes of ethics, and when we look at ethics more broadly, there's more than ever the argument that there's a need to pull apart or separate the legalistic aspect of these codes and the ethical aspect of these codes. Many components of these codes of ethics are required for a society to have a discipline that does such and such. You need a code of ethics for doctors in order for a society to have doctors. Or maybe I should say this a little more precisely. You need a code of practice for doctors in order for a society to have doctors. Just as you need a code of food hygiene in order for a society to have a food production and distribution system. If we can't count on the safety of our food, if we can't trust our food, then in many important respects, our food distribution system is not viable. Similarly, if we can't count on lawyers to respect certain provisions like confidentiality, respect for law, etc., then the idea of law as a practice falls apart. Too many criminal lawyers, and you can't depend on the lawyers being distinct from the criminals. Okay, I tried to make a joke there, and I think it kind of failed. But you get the idea. As opposed to the ethical side of things, which is the respect for the rights of people, thinking of people as a value, even loving people. These are good ethical principles, but when they're put into a code of practice, they feel like a bit of a stretch. Do you really require teachers to love their students? Or is it sufficient for the purpose of having a profession of teaching that teachers be competent, that they be fair, that they be just, etc.? So there's a bit of a pull here between the two sides of a code of ethics. And then, of course, there's the other problem. We've gone through a long list of values of codes of ethics, in codes of ethics, and Feld notwithstanding, there's no code of ethics that embodies all of these values, and there's not one value that is embodied in every code of ethics. So the idea that there's a consensus on the ethical values underlying codes of ethics in particular, and ethics in general, I think is wrong. And I don't think that we're going to be able to sit down and say, this value, this value, this value, we'll all agree on those, forget the rest. I don't think that ethics, with respect to analytics and AI, but ethics generally, is capable of such a resolution. Now, we're going to talk a bit more about codes of ethics. We still need to talk about the obligations generated by codes of ethics, and we need to talk about who these codes apply to and who the beneficiaries, or shall we say the stakeholders are, of these codes of ethics. But that's going to be for future presentations. As it is, this one at an hour and 12 minutes has gone on long enough, but I certainly hope that you've seen a lot to think about in this presentation of these core values underlying these codes of ethics, at least some of them, some of the time. I'm Stephen Downs, and I'll be back again soon. Thanks for joining me.